Hi and welcome to Police Stories Podcast. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force, serving across 3 different forces. A series of general ramblings, but also hopefully some interesting stuff on individual cases and also some of the training and incidents that I was involved with, which hopefully you found interesting. Welcome if this is your first time. If it is, possibly want to go back and start from the beginning, but entirely up to you. And welcome back to those if you're continuing to listen as we go. Thanks very much for the downloads again this week. Fantastic, really good. And on the Buy Me a Coffee app thing, you've got an option of spending a couple of quid and buying me a coffee if you like what you're hearing. I appreciate those that have done that. You can go on YouTube as well. Obviously not very exciting to watch, but certainly to listen to, and that gives you the opportunity to, ask some questions if there was on it, any, or make any comments, good, bad, or ugly. I'm not worried. So this is episode 57, and we've been talking about the dive team and some dives that I carried out during my time on the dive team. There is obviously quite a few more of those to come, but I want to try and break it up a little bit as well, so that it's perhaps not all boring if the diving side of it isn't interesting. So the team that I was on, I always refer to it as the dive team, but the reality was our official term was the UCSST, the Underwater and Confined Spaces Search Team. It's a bit of a mouthful. Most people just looked at it on the side of the truck and were like, what is that, and then we'll be like, why don't you just say dive team? So, well, because what we do confined space searches as well. Well, perhaps it's obvious, perhaps it's not, but you might ask, what are confined space searches and why do you need a team to do that? Well, I suppose they are as they sound. It's certainly, if you're claustrophobic, it's not for you. It's searching anywhere really that your normal average cop or a specialist search team, of which there were thousands in the Met, that were called LSOs, licensed search officers, and they would work underneath a PULSA, a police search advisor, who would coordinate any sort of search. But if they got to an area that was either boggy, wet, a stream, a river, or whatever, then they would hand that over to us in terms of sort of our dive capabilities or our wade search capabilities, which is when it's too shallow to be a dive, but it's still kind of, it might be knee deep or whatever. Your average cop with no dry suit or protective gear is not going to go into that, even if they're on a search team. So we would deal with that. But also the same, let's say they're carrying out a search, at a farm or a remote location, or it could be a town or whatever, and they suddenly open up a floor covering, or maybe some sort of manhole cover in the back garden, and there's perhaps a sewer system or anything really that is out of the norm, a small confined space, hence the name. That comes with its own risks in relation to all sorts of things, which we'll talk about now. So you also need specialist training and qualifications and equipment to actually carry out a safe, confined space search. And normally the people that do that sort of training work within the sort of sewer type environment. So, the big companies, Thames Water, Southern Water, Scottish Water, whoever, they have various people that are trained up in confined spaces that can then go, and they're not looking to search. They're obviously looking to, carry out maintenance or whatever on their sewers and their pipes and the various bits and pieces. Whereas we were looking to search, but we were still in that same environment. So we needed to be trained to work safely in that area. And it is a very dangerous area for a number of reasons. The big one is gases. Now, the unpleasant ones that you're thinking of if you're in a sewer, of course, but we're pretty good in my role at dealing with unpleasant smells. That's very much our bread and butter. We're not worried about those so much. We're more worried about the ones that reduce the level of oxygen. Now, that can happen for various reasons. The air that we're breathing, just walking down the street, sitting at home, wherever you are today, in your car, generally is made up of 21% oxygen within the atmosphere that you are breathing, and that is the accepted norm that we need to kind of survive. Now, you can go lower than that, but not much lower. You'd be surprised. You start getting down to sort of 14-15% oxygen for whatever reason, and you're going to feel lightheaded. Eventually you'll collapse, and then eventually, if you take it to the extreme, you will die. And every year, unfortunately, you do hear of this scenario. Quite often it happens in a farming environment. I've heard of a few scenarios like that where people have had large containers where they put all their chicken poo in, for example, and then they seal the lid. What happens is that process of breaking down actually reduces the oxygen in the air. And certainly a couple of scenarios that have happened that I'm aware of, and I think this happens unfortunately virtually every year, they've opened the lid up of this big, huge tank, 20,000 litres or whatever it is of sort of liquid chicken poo, and there's so little oxygen in the air, or the gases are so strong that they actually end up passing out or falling in. Well, now when you fall in those scenarios, or if you find yourself in a low oxygen environment, you don't kind of in the movies, take out your handkerchief and wet it and put it across your face and carry on. That's not going to happen. If it's really low, you'll literally just go unconscious immediately. There's no like, oh, I'm coughing and I feel a bit fat, bang, you're gone, And we've seen that in policing scenarios as well. There was one particularly that springs to mind where there was a very large cannabis cultivation in London, and they'd actually dug in the 40-foot shipping containers under the ground, so that obviously they couldn't be seen from above to keep it sort of clandestine. And then they had people going in periodically, to feed the plants, to attend the watering and turn the lights on, or the hydroponic setup, or whatever it was. The police came to find out about this. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but cops went there, uniformed cops who have no knowledge of this sort of stuff went there, and not realising that because they'd been buried in underground, there was no ventilation getting to these things. So there was a lack of oxygen in those shipping containers. So the first cop in through the door basically collapsed and went unconscious and was dragged out, which is then where my team was called in. Now, I actually wasn't involved in this particular one. I've seen the photos and I'm aware of it, but I wasn't actually there myself. But basically our guys had to go in with their specialist equipment. And like I said, a lot of the dive equipment, the breathing apparatus kind of crosses into what is used within the confined space environment. So, we were the obvious choice to be trained in it. And basically our guys had to carry out the search and do the initial retrieval until they could get enough fresh air into this location for people without specialist equipment, to be able to breathe and go into those places. I mean, what other sort of places, might we search, just to give you an idea? So the obvious one is whenever you get royalty or, Prime Minister or someone like that, and perhaps visiting heads of state, going to pretty much anywhere, whether it's, they're opening a community centre or they're going into one of the large concert halls, Albert Hall or somewhere like that in London, or pretty much anywhere, there's going to be lecterns, where they stand and give their speech. And underneath those lecterns and around about, you'll probably find tunnels and voids, and pretty much anywhere where there is a void, then obviously there's a possibility that somebody who doesn't agree with the person that's there could plant a device, could put a bomb basically. So all those places need to be searched. And we used to carry out, probably at least 100 searches a year, confined space searches, for when you had this scenario. So sewers as well is the obvious one. Whitehall, where Downing Street is, all around there, lots of sewers, as you'd imagine, central London. If anything's happening there, particularly on the big events, the sort of Trooping of the Colour, and when you have Memorial Day in November in the UK, it's a big deal. You have literally thousands and thousands of people going there, as well as the royals going to lay wreaths and things. So all down Whitehall there, all has to be searched above ground, as you'd expect, but equally very much gets searched below ground, So you would regularly find yourself doing searches of sewers. Now, on that scenario, we'd be looking for devices, obviously bombs, but equally, if there's been a murder, if there's no sort of body of water around for the bad guy or girl to throw their murder weapon into, certainly we've seen, and you've seen it on the movies correctly, that they might drop that weapon down into the drains, throw it into various swampy areas or anything, that could be a confined space. Anywhere there's a void, basically, there is a potential to hide something, whether that's a weapon or a device. So there would be lots of searches carried out, and all of those that potentially have low oxygen are dangerous. We would carry out rummage searches on ships that came in conjunction with Border Force. And if you get down into the bilges of a ship, anywhere that you have water and metal, you get an oxidization process, that is the sort of rusting process that reduces the level of oxygen in the air. One scenario that comes to mind now, this is a long time ago, I think this is probably 40 years ago at least, but Essex Police had a couple of divers training, and they had it was like a rusty barge that was partially in the water and partially out, but the only way to access it was down underneath it, under the water. So their dive team, I think, were doing some training there, and they put a couple of their guys inside this rusty hull, basically. And one of them, now I believe, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but they weren't using, what we use now, the full face masks that are perhaps a bit difficult to take off. I think they had normal sport diving regs that you'd just be holding in your mouth, like you'd see scuba divers wearing. And my understanding is that one of them took their reg out of their mouth, not knowing that oxidization process had severely lowered the oxygen level within that sort of rusting barge, and he died. The diver died, unfortunately, almost immediately, I would imagine. So they sent a second diver in to recover him, who also had similar issues, and finally it took a third diver to go in and recover them both, because it's so dangerous to say. It's not going to be you're coughing, you're feeling lightheaded. If it's that low, it will be, instantaneous passing out or death. So it's a very, it is a very serious thing. And quite often we would find, uniformed cops just, thinking they can stroll into somewhere, because in fairness, they didn't have any sort of, training, or anything to suggest, it's not like you get this in police training college, to, don't go into any confined spaces. You see something, particularly if it's something you're looking for on a search, and you think, I'll just wander in and grab that, So the course that we did was run by Thames Water, and they had a specialist training facility, and I'm sure all the water companies do, who obviously they would normally train their guys, their flushing men, or their flushers as they call them. These are the guys that work in the sewers, sort of making sure they don't get filled up with fatbergs and all sorts of unpleasantness that, sort of chokes up sewers. And in this specialist facility, they had an underground part that was a series of concrete tunnels, a maze effectively, and you could work your way into this maze, and it was all fairly small. It had to be, you couldn't stand up in there. It was all hands and knees stuff. So you had to get into the pipes, you're on hands and knees, and you had to crawl into this inner chamber, which kind of went all around the houses, and then several places throughout those tunnels. Now, this was completely black. There was no lights in there at all. They put in baffles, so large wooden lumps that sort of stretch the width of these things, these pipes. So you're now on your hands and knees crawling through in what's quite a hot environment. You'd be wearing a dry suit, or maybe overalls, but certainly on a live job we'd be wearing a dry suit, because there's all sorts of unpleasant water things going on in most of the searches we would do. But for training purposes, we'd probably have a boiler suit on. You'd have a hard hat, and a torch, or even torches can be dangerous, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So you would make your way through into this inner chamber, and they had the ability to stand above you, the instructors, and at any point they could open one of the hatches above you so that you'd sort of flood it with light. And if you got stuck, or if they had people that were freaking out and they needed to get out of there, they could lift the lid and basically let you out, or they could see what was going on. But as a rule, it was pitch black in there, and these baffles meant you couldn't just shuffle your way through. You had to shuffle so far through the tunnels, and then you would have to lift yourself up and climb over these obstructions. So they did some training, and you always wore an alarm, a personal alarm on you that let you know the gas levels. You always carried an emergency escape set, which was a small sort of set on your waist, effectively, that you could rip open, and that gave you a face mask to give you oxygen should the levels drop too low and your alarm start sounding. So we did some training around that, and obviously there's a load of regulations and paperwork stuff you have to know, and some tests, and the course lasts about a week, and it culminates in Dead Fred, who we talked about last week, which is basically a 14-stone dummy, a life size pretend body, both in weight and size. Dead Fred normally gets placed right in the middle chamber, the most awkward place he could possibly be, and then the team is sent in to go and rescue him. And it's very difficult, very hot and sweaty work. And quite often they'll put, sort of smoke into the chamber as well. Not that you can see anything anyway, but it just adds that, buggeration factor. So you might find that you're on sort of breathing apparatus to go in, which is very hard again, because when you start working hard and you're breathing against breathing apparatus, it does limit the amount of airflow you get. So if ever anyone was going to panic or say, hang on a sec, I'm claustrophobic, or confined spaces are not for me, this is the time to find out, and regularly you would, So you'd work your way to this inner chamber. That wasn't too bad. But when you got hold of Dead Fred, of course, he is very, very heavy. And you had to drag him back out and rescue him. Well, that was a right pain, because obviously he's heavy, and you could drag him so far down the tunnels. And then you had to work together as a team to sort of lift him up and over these baffles that, you know, narrowed the width of the tunnel by half, maybe in some cases. So you're having to hump this heavy dummy over top of these you know, these wood sort of obstructions that were deliberately put in their way just to be awkward. I mean, it was quite a good course. I quite enjoyed it, but yeah, very hard work. And at the end of it, you come away from it with a qualification. But more importantly, you're able to now safely, you know, go and search these various areas. So what does a typical confined space look like? Well, let's talk about a sewer job, for example. So the first thing we do is we'd have had identified, you know, that we needed to search a particular area. So the PULSA, the police search advisor, would say to us, I want this sewer searched because, you know, a member of the royal family or the Prime Minister or someone is coming to visit, and this is directly below, you know, the route they'll be taking, or whatever it was. We would probably go and do a recce to start with. We would go and have a look, and maybe on a few days before, just to get a feel for the basic stuff, really. Where we're going to park our truck, where could we move, you know, our kit to, how many people does this need? Invariably, it would need at least 6 people on the team, you know, which would be a lot of people. So, sorry, there's going to be a very heavy lorry just coming past, so just going to be a bit of noise in the background. I apologise. So you would... you go and wreck it, you go and figure it out, and then on the day, and quite often these would be very early starts, sort of 3 or 4 in the morning, because you know, by kind of 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, they needed to have roads closed and all the searching done before public turned up. So we would first arrive at the scene, and it would be a bit like a dive brief. You know, the supervisor would identify who was the searchers, who was the standby, who was a rescue person to be able to go in and help should there be a problem. Then you'd have attendants, you know, you'd probably have somebody on communications, although generally we wouldn't use radios, etc., because all sorts of issues around about, you know, electrics and sparks and things. And we were talking about torches earlier. Even torches aren't easy. You can't just pick up your torch and go in. You have to have a specialist torch, you know, that specifically is signed off that it creates no sparks and things when you turn it on, because you can imagine if you're in a scenario where there's explosive gases in a sewer and you go flicking on a conventional torch, you know, that could be enough for the whole place to go up. So you know, there's a lot of specialist kit. So we would go along, and let's say we've identified our sewer, we would lift the lid on that sewer, and then ideally, you know, sort of 50 yards or however far away it was down the road in a different direction, you would find another manhole cover which would link to the one you just opened. Now the idea was we wanted to put some fresh air into that environment to sort of, you know, flush it out of any gases. So we would use our specialist sort of tools. They're like big keys with handholds on them that you'd insert into the lids, because the lids are very, very heavy. They have to withstand, you know, buses and trucks like the one that just passed, you know, going over them. So they have to be really substantial bits of kit. So 2 of you would go and attach these big metal keys and lift the sewer lid off. And then what would happen is you would give it, you know, like 10 minutes or something while you were setting up for the air hopefully to blow through, and for any unpleasant, or, well, there's going to be unpleasant, but more importantly, dangerous gases to disappear, you know, from that area. And then to make sure as well, we would immediately, when we turned up, lower one of our specialist gas sensors down into the sewer itself, where we would keep it generally about kind of half a metre off the bottom, and that would stay in there with its sensors on for the whole time while we were kitting up. So you would get kitted a bit like a dive operation in a dry suit. But a different dry suit to our diving ones. Firstly, they're easier to clean, because we didn't really want to take our diving ones in there, because sometimes we got absolutely minging, you know, real messes in these sewers, you can imagine. So you would climb into these environments, and you'd have dry suit on that would be sealed at the neck and the wrists with latex probably. It would have welly boots on it, but they'd be attached as part of the unit as such. And obviously you'd have gloves on. You'd then have a hard hat with probably like a miner's lamp on it, which again is kind of signed off safe for those environments. You would have your emergency escape kit across you, which would be your sort of emergency breathing set to get out there, and you'd have your own personal gas monitor on as well. So after we've sort of flushed the air out of that sewer system a bit, and then we have we pulled up the first monitor that we lowered into the hole. Remember, and we left that 1/2 meter off the bottom, and we would check the readings on that and see what's the oxygen level. Is there any explosive gases or anything dangerous in there? And if we were happy, that would get lowered back down and would stay there for the entire job, just in case things changed. Now, some of the sewers have sort of horseshoe ladders that are set into the brickwork that you can climb down in, but some of them have no way in at all. And it's not really reasonable or practical to put in a conventional ladder. So sometimes we would have to use a tripod to lower ourselves into the environment. And that again takes some training and setting up, but basically it's a large metal tripod that has a huge, what looks like effectively a huge sort of fishing reel on it, which has cable on it, wire, that's capable of taking a person. And you would always have a harness on if you were doing this sort of work. So you'd be clipped off on the harness, and then you'd be lowered down into this scenario. And in fact, what I'll do is the photo that I put on for this episode, I'll put on a photo of me hanging in one of these tripods prior to going into a live job, just so you can see what I mean. And you then get lowered down into the sewer, and once you're down there, you've then got to disconnect yourself, which is easier than it sounds, or harder than it sounds, in fact, because where it connects is basically the base of your neck. So you have to reach back and kind of almost with two hands and blind unclip this harness from behind your neck, and then you would carry out your search. Now, if you're looking for a device, for example, then it could be a sort of walk through the sewer, for example. It didn't have to be sort of fingertips or anything, because what you're looking for is quite a substantial device. Don't forget, the sewer's already 10 meters down. So to put a device that's actually going to have any effect on anything happening on the surface, it would have to be really quite substantial. So it should stand out. But if you were looking for, a weapon or something that had been dropped down the drain or the sewer, that was a lot slower time. And even worse, if there was liquid running along the bottom of the sewer, you can imagine just how unpleasant that was. A couple of things that all surprised me is when we searched along Whitehall, right by Downing Street, we always found loads of condoms. And I never really understood that, used condoms, I might add, because as far as I know, it's mainly offices there. There's no one's houses there. It's kind of workplaces. So I was always a bit concerned at just how many there was down there. There's obviously all sorts of unpleasant, toilet type things in there, whether it's, sanitary items or actual feces, really unpleasant. But there's also quite a few rats down there. And it always made me chuckle that the biggest rats were sort of under Downing Street or under and around Downing Street. Now, if you're into your politics at all, certainly in the UK, then you'd probably understand that, lots of people to tell you there's lots of rats in Parliament and in the government and around Downing Street and what have you, without getting too political. But certainly, yeah, very, very big rats. And you'd have your torch on. And of course, these sewers, they're straightish, but quite often, you'd have bends and turns and 90-degree angles and what have you. And so you would get to a T-junction, say, and you'd stand there and you'd shine your torch in one direction and you'd shine it in the other. And all you'd have is like hundreds of little eyes looking back at you, which presumably were rats. I never actually explored it. It could have been anything. But yes, I'm pretty sure they were rats. So it certainly wasn't a place, to go if you were easily spooked, or if you didn't like rats, So it was, pretty unpleasant environment. You can imagine the smell as well. But that was something actually you got used to quite quickly. In the summer as well, it was exceptionally hot down there. It was really unpleasant. If it was a hot sunny day, and it had been for a while in the summer, it could be absolutely boiling down there. So you had the added thing of, you were absolutely pouring sweat, as well as all these smells and the rats and the stuff floating by. Yeah, it's fair to say it's not for everyone. So that's what a typical search would be like. You'd carry out your search, and at all times you're having to, you might still be connected to a line as well, possibly to the surface, or you might have had to disconnect if you had a series of junctions to go round. And quite often in that scenario, we would have one of the flushers with us, one of the Thames water flushers with us, because very, very dangerous places, the sewers, and these guys and girls, were absolute experts in the field. They knew exactly where the danger points was. And every now and then what they would do is they would block off certain areas and they would force water, they would flush the sewers effectively to clear blockages. Now, that could be happening at any time of the day or night at any location, but these flushers knew exactly when and where that was going to happen, so they came with us from a safety point of view. Because you can imagine if you're down and you're in sewers, the bigger sewers you could stand up in, and they were maybe 6-8 feet tall, sort of at least a 2.5 meters tall. But when they flush them, you get a body of water that comes down top to bottom, and if you were down there at the time, especially if you were not attached to a line, you would literally be carried away, and they're an absolute maze. Not only would you probably drown, but you'd be completely lost as well. So yeah, dangerous places, certainly. And I can only think of probably half a dozen times really where the alarms actually sounded that there was low oxygen, or that there was an explosive gas present, and the instant reaction then is to basically break open your emergency breathing set and put that on, and then make your way back to the surface as you would expect. Yeah, quite interesting environment, certainly different places, and we got to some, there's sort of confined spaces, all sorts of places you wouldn't think of particularly. One of the more unusual ones I can think of is Wimbledon. My understanding is it's completely changed now, but there used to be a very large hole at the Wimbledon, sort of international tennis place, more a cavern really in a certain location. It was quite a sensitive place, so it's completely changed now, it's no longer there, but every year we would have to go to Wimbledon and the tennis, and of course you'd have all these very posh people in their pristine whites and what have you, and there was us getting lowered by tripod in our dry suits that had been down sewers that were literally minging horrible stinky suits, us covered in all sorts of unpleasantness, getting lowered in the middle of sort of hoi polloi down into these holes to go and search and make sure that there was nothing in there that there should be. So yeah, it was quite interesting, certainly, and on murder jobs and what have you, we recovered some very unpleasant articles from these areas. But yeah, confined space search is quite different for sure. Just briefly, a couple of people have asked me as well about how do I do these podcasts? Do I, have them sort of scripted and written down and what have you? Occasionally I will have notes if I'm doing a particular one, like I have actually today, because there's a few bits and pieces I wanted to make sure I got in today and didn't want to forget. But if not, what I did was in my career, some 20-25 years ago, in my phone just started making literally a couple of lines, a title of an incident that I dealt with that I thought one day might be suitable for a book or something like that. That was in the days before podcasts. So I've got 100 and something individual sort of titles of things that I've dealt with. Now, some of the more serious or juicy, if you want to call them, scenarios, I remember very, very well. Some very much are etched on my mind. So I can literally just sit down with you guys and girls and just reel off what happened, and then sort of bolt on my own thoughts. Obviously I keep an eye on the time because I try and keep these to around about half an hour. You probably don't want me rambling on too long. But yeah, occasionally I have notes, and it'll just be bullet points of things that I want to make sure I get across during that time. But it's certainly not, scripted word for word or anything like that. It's a bit more relaxed than that, and hopefully it comes across all right. I must be doing something vaguely okay, because it would seem that getting on for 12,000 of you have downloaded it. Perhaps that's just out of pity, I don't know. But anyway, so a little bit shorter today because we're pretty much done, and I won't just ramble on for the sake of it. Thanks very much for listening. Confined space searches. Next week we'll be on to some more dive jobs. As I say, I got a few more of those before we move on again. But I hope you've enjoyed it, and keep coming back, please. That's good. And thanks for listening. You take it easy, and we speak soon. Cheers then. Bye.